A poker game that reunited a father and son in death, two of the most important figures in American history whose lives and deaths were eerily intertwined, and two men whose deaths oddly bookended the First World War. These are terrifying coincidences in history that could be glitches in reality. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were two of the most important figures in American history. Despite their political differences, they grew closer later in life and actually became pretty good friends. What's really bizarre though is how both of them passed away on the same day. Now that's already quite a coincidence, but the day they passed away, July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the very document they both helped draft. Adams, at the age of 90, had been in relatively good health, but collapsed in his reading chair that afternoon. His last words reportedly were, "Jefferson still lives." But no, Jefferson had actually died earlier that day around noon, after battling illness for some time. News of their deaths circulated quickly, and across the nation commemorations were held to honor them. The circumstances surrounding their deaths are eerie for sure, but there's some beauty to this story as well. The pair had been political adversaries in the past, but toward the end of their lives they became friends, and in the end they were tied together in a way no one could have ever predicted. Their deaths on the same day have come to kind of symbolize the shared ideals and values that defined the founding of the United States. In 1858, a bizarre coincidence occurred in San Francisco that involved a poker game, a man's death, and an unlikely twist of fate. Robert Fallon, a British man, was killed for cheating at a poker game at the Bella Union Saloon. Fallon's $600 winnings were left behind. See, the superstition at the time was that money won through cheating was unlucky. So the players decided to give the $600 pot to the first stranger who walked by, hoping he'd take Fallon's place at the table and they'd eventually win all the money back. They called a young man over who sat down and incredibly turned that $600 into $2,200. Police soon arrived to investigate the guy who'd just been killed and asked for that $600 back so they could pass it on to Fallon's next of kin. Well, it turned out that Fallon's next of kin was right there at the table already. He was the stranger that had been walking by the saloon and took his father's place, only he didn't know it. He hadn't seen his father in 7 years. It's hard to say whether this next woman had terrible luck or incredible luck. It's a kind of a perfect blend of both, really. Violet Jessop's life sounds like something out of a movie, but it's all true. This Irish-Argentine woman survived the sinking of both the Titanic and its sister ship, the Britannic. On April 14, 1912, Jessop was working as a stewardess on the Titanic when it struck an iceberg and began to sink. In the chaos, she was told to serve as an example to non-English speaking passengers, showing them how to board their lifeboats. She eventually made it off the ship, escaping in lifeboat 16. Speaking of the number 16, on November 21st, 1916, Jessop was serving as a nurse on the Britannic when it hit a mine and began sinking in the Aegean River. She grabbed a lifeboat and held on, eventually being rescued. Remarkably, she'd also suffered an injury to her head during the incident. Now, the fact that she'd survived both of these incidents is amazing, but what makes it all even stranger is that before all of this, she'd also sailed on the RMS Olympic, which collided with a British warship in 1911. So she survived all three of these accidents. It just seems like the universe did not want this woman sailing on boats. The first and the last deaths of World War I are a chilling coincidence. John Parr and George Ellison were the first and last British soldiers killed during the war. Parr was killed on August 21st, 1914, only 17 days after Britain declared war. Then on November 11th, 1918, just 90 minutes before the war ended, George Ellison, age 40, was killed. What's strange is that the two soldiers are buried right across from each other in St. Symphorian Military Cemetery, Belgium, separated by only 15 feet of grass. And no, this was not done on purpose. Their graves were placed there without any knowledge of their first and last statuses at the time. Out of every British soldier who died in the First World War, the first and last to die lay right across from each other. It's as if history itself placed them together, almost bookending the war. In the 1920s, American novelist Anne Parrish had an eerie experience while in Paris, also kind of sweet though. While browsing a bookstore, she came across an old book that she remembered fondly from her childhood, Jack Frost and Other Stories. She picked it up, showing it to her husband, telling him about how much she loved the book when she was young. Her husband went to open it, and he noticed there was an inscription on the inside. and Parrish, 209 North Weber Street, Colorado Springs. Turned out this was Anne's very same childhood copy of the book. I don't know what god this guy pissed off, but his life story sounds pretty biblical, in a wrathful punishment sort of way. This poor sap named Walter Summerford was struck by lightning 4 times, 3 times while he was alive and once after his death, just as a final middle finger from above. It all started in 1918 when Summerford, then a major in the British Army during World War I, was struck by lightning on a battlefield in Belgium. Already wild being struck by lightning as is, especially while in battle though, as if life wasn't already hard enough for him. Anyway, that was just strike 1, and it left him paralyzed from the waist down. He persevered though, and after finally recovering and retiring to Vancouver, where he had a solid 6 years lightning free, he was struck a second time while fishing, leaving him paralyzed on the right side. Somehow he survived again though. Then in 1930, while taking a walk in the park, one of the most innocent, inoffensive things a person can do, he was struck by lightning a 3rd time, this time leaving him bedridden until his death 2 years later. But as I said, he wasn't even off the hook yet, as his gravestone was then struck by lightning, making it the 4th strike in his life, or afterlife. In Monza, Italy, King Umberto I and a local restaurant owner had a very strange encounter. The 2 men were nearly identical in appearance, first off, down to their face and build, and after discussing their striking resemblance, they discovered even more eerie similarities. Both were born on March 14th of 1844 in the same town. Both men had married women named Margherita. The restaurant owner even opened his restaurant on the same day that King Umberto was crowned King of Italy. Then on July 29th, 1900, King Umberto was informed that the restaurant owner had been killed that day in a mysterious accident. Well, just after the king received the news, an anarchist named Gaetano Bresci fired at the king 4 times, killing him instantly. The man had been seeking to avenge the people killed in Milan during the suppression of the riots in May of 1898. This next story is unbelievable and incredibly beautiful in a way. So in 1914, a German mother had her infant son's photo taken and left the film to be developed at a store in Strasbourg. When World War I broke out though, she couldn't go back for it of course, so she just assumed that she'd never get to see the photo. Well, fast forward 2 years and she bought a new film plate in Frankfurt to take a picture of her newborn daughter. She developed the photo and was upset at first. There was something wrong with the picture, but when she looked more closely, she noticed the photo was a double exposure. Her daughter's picture was overlaid with her son from 2 years before. Somehow her original undeveloped film had been mislabeled as unused and was sold back to her. So she finally got to develop her son's photo, just not in the way she'd been expecting. In 1838, Edgar Allan Poe wrote the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, where the crew of a stranded ship draws straws to decide who will be sacrificed for food. The unlucky soul is a cabin boy named Richard Parker, who ends up being killed and eaten by the others. In true Poe fashion, it's a grim tale, but unlike his more fantastical work, this one would actually play out in real life. In 1884, a ship sank, and the survivors were stranded at sea, starving. They drew straws to determine who would be sacrificed, and the person picked was the cabin boy, whose name was Richard Parker. Fictional account from nearly half a century earlier seemed to mirror a real-life event, almost like the story had somehow been predicting the future. Henry Ziegland was born in 1861 in Honeygrove, Texas. He was a farmer who got involved with a woman named Charla Harris, but in 1883 he ended the relationship. Charla was devastated. So devastated that she ended up taking her own life. Her brother was completely distraught. He blamed Henry for his sister's death and decided that he wanted some revenge. Well, one day he snuck into Henry's barn with a firearm and fired at him. The bullet only grazed Henry, but he smartly played dead. What Henry didn't know though was that the bullet had lodged itself into a tree by the barn. Well, 20 years later, Henry decided he was going to chop down that very tree. It was too thick for an axe, so he decided he'd need to blow it up. When the explosion went off, Henry died instantly. It wasn't from the blast. The bullet that had been lodged in the tree 2 decades earlier flew out at him. Absolutely nuts. All that said, I have been your host James, and I will catch you, yes you specifically, in the next video.